I read The Ministry for the Future by Stanley Robinson. This is a science fiction novel that I've read before, or I guess the new genre, the cool genre, is climate fiction. I started reading this on Earth Day of this year, and like I said, I've read it before. So the novel is quite wide. It's set in a near future from the time that it was written, which is basically like the present of today. And basically what happens at the beginning of the book, there is an event that takes place in equatorial India during the summertime, quote unquote summertime. They really don't have a summer. They have like monsoon and not monsoon season, but it's not monsoon season. And the humidity and heat, along with the direct sunlight, create temperatures and humidity conditions that bake people alive, and millions of people die in this one day because the weather is so hot that sweating does not allow you to cool off like your skin and your body and stuff like that. And so many people are trying to use air conditioning that it overwhelms the power grid system and the electricity shuts off for lots and lots of people. So they can't get relief from the weather through air conditioning either. And then a bunch of people go to like water sources. Like there's a big lake where this part of the story happens, and they get in the lake, but the lake water is even warmer than human body temperature. So it's actually warming your body up even more, kind of like being in bath water instead of allowing you to cool off. And so lots of people die in the water also. And people try to just naturally drink the water because they're so dehydrated from sweating and whatnot. And the water is full of dead bodies and bodily fluids and all kinds of stuff. So it ends up poisoning them. So the ones who don't die from the heat end up dying from poisoning, and on like that. So this is like a dramatization of one of the effects of climate change in a possible future. That the first people who are going to feel the effects of an ever-mounting temperature change in the climate are going to be people in equatorial regions who already have conditions of high humidity, places like Africa, India, and so on. And so the narrative here is focused in on a character named Frank May, who is an aid worker from America, and he is running like a hospital type place that's free to the community. He has some air conditioning, and he lets people into the facility where he has a window unit going and tries to usher in as many people as he can. It's not really cooling people off per se, but it's like 80 degrees versus 100 something degrees outside with lower humidity. So it's like tolerable if you just sit there and don't move too much and breathe shallowly. But eventually the power goes out and there's all these people in the building and there's nothing they can do. So they wait for the sun to go down, and then they go to the lake and try to cool off that way, and it doesn't work. And this traumatizes Frank really badly for really the rest of his life. He gets PTSD from this event, and he goes into counseling later, but the event also radicalizes him because he feels like something must be done about climate change, because look at the impact that it's having on people's lives. Like he was right there kind of at a ground zero event, if you will. So I think Robinson is kind of calibrating the book here to give this book is written in English, it's published in America, and I would say like it's aimed at Anglosphere readers who are going to be mostly white people. And so we have a character here who is a white man, and that gives us like a touchstone character to be like, okay, this person is ostensibly like me. Like I said, it's a science fiction book, mainly aimed at men. Of course, everybody reads science fiction, but you get what I'm saying. So that's why I think that Frank is here at the beginning of the story. He is kind of an anchor character that we can relate to as the reader and kind of invest in and have the same kind of feelings that Frank does from the event. Because the narrative is going to shift a lot throughout the book. Frank is not the only perspective character. In fact, there are a lot of perspective characters. And I would say that Frank mainly exists in the beginning part of the book here. And the emphasis shifts to another character named Mary Murphy, she's Irish and an older lady. And she is really who I would say is the main character of the book if we had to point to one character. And Frank's story intersects with her story, but he becomes kind of a supporting character to her story, if you will. And in some ways, he's almost abstracted into her conscience, or on a certain level, like her shadow self, I would say, like in a Jungian idea almost. But I think it's really important right up front here in the story to set up a scenario that is shocking to us as the reader, that brings into like really sharp relief the ways in which climate change is an emergency. It's not just like an abstract thing that's going to happen in the future. It's something that's directly impacting not just this one guy, Frank's life, but millions and millions of lives, and giving us a touchstone to feel that. Because when so many people die, and in a way that's like a kind of natural disaster, like an earthquake, tsunami, whatever, that doesn't really hit you in the gut the way that I think this opening kind of prologue story does. So I think Robinson does a good job of like grabbing our attention and centering the problem of the story, if you will, kind of the antagonism of the story on the climate change. And so like, who is responsible for that? We have like the, classic paradigms for conflict in a story where you have man versus man and man versus nature. And so this story would seem to be like, oh, it's man versus nature, right? Like nature is out to kill us with high humidity and high temperatures. But of course, that problem is caused by human beings. It is the structure of our culture that is causing climate change to happen. And so the book really looks at that aspect of climate change. And that's why the perspective has to spread out so much for the rest of the book, because the problem is not like one particular corporate overlord or political leader who is bamboozling the rest of society and, like causing climate change in order to achieve whatever their nefarious goals is. It's all of modern human culture that uses electricity causing the climate to warm up over time. And so it's going to take the collective effort of everyone to solve the problem. The book is kind of calibrated to be highly realistic, I would say. This is like a hard sci-fi novel, if you will, in that it tries very much to follow the rules of physics. It examines actual solutions that are available to us in the near future, and then kind of extrapolates what would happen if we go down these different scenarios. And the book also does not offer a single solution for solving climate change. Instead, there's a kind of constellation of different solutions that work together in order to achieve the goals of not having this situation that happens in India repeat itself. So right off the bat, one of the solutions that we get is putting into the atmosphere a kind of synthetic volcanic ash blow that will reflect the sunlight in the upper atmosphere back out into outer space and not allow the carbon in the atmosphere to warm up as much as it would if the sunlight made it through the upper atmosphere and warmed up the planet. This is an initiative that is taken up by the Indian government, and they do this in the face of the kind of Paris Climate Accords that happened in the late 2010s, and like where the treaties were further ratified in the 2020s. I guess we're still in the 2020s, but it's funny because like there's a lot of predictions that happen in this book, like short-term predictions. Like there's a recession that happens in 2020. There's this event happens in 2024, 2025, something like that with India. And then there's, more things that go on from that. But I think America is like already out of the Paris Climate Accords because of Trump. And I don't know that Robinson really foresaw the kind of reactionary as, I mean, that stuff's in the book, but like this particular kind of reactionary as of a single leader who hates the idea of climate change having such an outsized effect as leading America out of that treaty, which they were a major player in constructing in the first place. But anyway, the treaty holders don't want India to do this because they're worried about knock-on effects. They're worried about unintended consequences that could emerge from kind of quote unquote polluting the atmosphere to achieve a kind of temporary cooling effect that doesn't really solve the long-term carbon problem. And so this idea is based on a volcanic explosion that happened in the 1990s, I think, if I remember right. And it had the unintended, well, I mean, there's no intention at all because it's like a volcano that blew up, because of pressures inside the earth. But something that we didn't expect to happen from the volcano blasting off was that the ash in the upper atmosphere cooled the global temperature by a couple of degrees for a year or two. And so it was kind of like, that's crazy. And so the Indian government want to repeat this by, taking jet airplanes with payloads of special, I can't remember what it is, some kind of special chemicals that are aerosoled and then like releasing them into the upper atmosphere to the point where like you can't even, it's so high up you can't see. This is not like in the Matrix movies where they completely blot out the skies or something. It's a very like small quote unquote effect. And it's directly over India itself. Although obviously this is going to move around the globe after they do it. And the Indian people demand that something be done in the wake of millions of people dying from heat in this catastrophe that happened at the beginning of the book. And so this is the action that the government comes up with. The world kind of tries to censure them. They do it anyway. And the entire thing kind of happens because of a radical political sea change that is a direct knock-on effect of the weather catastrophe. So the government that was in place, which is still the main party in power in India right now in the real world, is a kind of very right-leaning, religiously fundamentalist, kind of proto-fascist group that is like other right-leaning proto-fascists all around the globe, very into burning oil, burning coal, against climate change, seeing it as some kind of scientific conspiracy to control industry and reduce profits and blah, 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 blah. That group was voted out because of this catastrophe happening. And a group, that said, we are going to be hard on climate change. We are going to have real scientific solutions. And we are also going to become the world leader in this kind of science. And, running on all of that got them elected. And so this is their first initiative with their plan. And so I think right there you can see like a microcosm of the way that Robinson is posing the problem of climate change and the relationship between like capitalist industry and government at large. And also the scientific community and the community of governments in the world. So I just said a whole bunch of things. So let me take a step back and kind of explain what I'm saying there. So I think that Robinson does not see this problem as a simple kind of light switch on-off situation, that if we just all as consumers kind of boycotted certain products, then the global temperature problem would start to reverse and everything would be fixed. The solution has to come through government, and government has to put pressure on the system of capitalism. It has to leverage the military-industrial complex, and it has to work with global finance, all at the same time, while also working with other governments who have their own self-interested goals and their own kind of relationship with climate change as a political issue, all at the same time. Like, all of that stuff has to happen together. And that's just one part of the story. So, like, the story is really big and really complex, but it feels extremely satisfying and well captured at the same time. Like, it's really impressive what the book does, because it manages to be dramatic and entertaining and funny and all the other stuff that you want a book to be at the same time as grappling with all of this stuff. So India is using its military jets to deploy a scientifically engineered solution kind of from its educational department, if you will, from its university system in the global kind of climate change community at large, working in tandem with them. And then it has to grapple with the global government system, the UN, and other, political allies and adversaries, and how they're weighing in on the whole thing and how this might cause them to have political censure and on like that. So there's lots of different factors and different pressures at play for India here. But they end up doing it. The program is a success. It temporarily lowers the temperature in the atmosphere, and it has a global effect. And there are not any serious knock-on effects or unintended side effects that happen from the program. And so what we see is that, just in microcosm at the beginning of the story, there is a government that is elected by the people. It has a mandate to take climate change seriously. It flies in the face of conventional wisdom. It uses a science-based approach to solve the problem. It does so in the face of opposition and pressure to the contrary, and then it achieves its goal. And that structure is repeated and reapplied throughout the book. It is kind of the model for which we're just going to see over and over in the novel. This is the way that humanity solves climate change. And I think it's kind of the thesis of the book in terms of, I think there's a clear political message that Robinson has with the book. This is not an apolitical novel. It's taking climate change science seriously, and it's saying the only way to solve this problem is through democratically elected governments making legislative changes to the structure of our society. It's the only way to do it, which is a position that I agree with. It is actually the thing that causes the problem in the first place, right? The elected governments of the world have permitted pollution to run rampant because of the interests of capitalists and the financial sector to achieve profits over the safety and well-being of the global community and also the national citizens of which they are responsible. Like, that is just a simple fact of history, which means that if that is the way that all of this happened, the way to undo it is through the same set of tools. So, like, science kind of created plastic pollution in the ocean. Science can create the solutions to plastic pollution in the ocean, is kind of what I'm saying. And the thing that needs to happen is that laws need to be enacted such that the incentives and the disincentives are calibrated to make these changes more likely to happen. And that is where Mary Murphy comes into the story. She is a diplomat at the United Nations, and she is the head of a department that is supposed to be considering legislation that members of the UN will consider implementing in their countries that has to do with thinking of the citizens who are not born yet as having rights and a place at the table. And this part of the UN, this like ministry, if you will, is named the Ministry for the Future by people outside of the UN, and then they adopt the name as the name of their bureaucracy. They're part of the bureaucracy. They're the Ministry of the Future. This is where the book gets its name. And so their mandate is to look to the future and kind of advocate for the generations that are not born yet and try to address climate change, things like the Paris Accords, and like enforce them with various members of the United Nations. So like I said, what ends up happening is that Frank May gets PTSD from this event in India. He tries to carry on with his life, but being in places where, it has hot, muggy summers, if he gets a whiff of high humidity, he starts to have panic attacks and freak out. He talks to various psychologists trying to solve this problem, but he's skeptical of the solutions that they're offering. And I think there's something here that Robinson is presenting that, there's like a normal human reaction in a way that Frank is having to this event. It was very traumatizing. He almost died. Millions of people did die. And then the response to that of the world was like, wow, that is a really sad thing that happened, but we're not going to do anything about the root cause of it because it's really inconvenient for us to do that. And who even knows if the reason it happened was because of climate change? I mean, it's really hot in India and they should really have more air conditioners. Am I right? That response takes away, any agency that he has, and the advice that he gets from a kind of professional class tier of society in the form of a psychologist is kind of like learn to cope and get over it. Like, here are the ways in which if you do these things, you will not have these bad feelings anymore. When it seems like the answer to the actual problem should be for him to dive back into the problem, like he was a volunteer trying to help people in India in the first place. He should dive back into the culture and find some way to have agency to fight back against climate change in a direct way. And that would solve his problem. But that's not the advice that he's given. The advice that he's given is to do these kind of cognitive exercises that create new neural connections in his brain that have to do with like moving your eyes around while you are thinking about the event. And now you won't remember the event when the trigger happens of being in high humidity. You'll remember moving your eyes around a lot, and that doesn't feel dangerous and bad and make you feel panic. So you're kind of like throwing up a barrier or like kind of tricking, quote unquote, your brain into getting past this situation. But the situation is like, it's an emergency. Like, you should not get over it, I guess. Like, this kind of research is useful for some things. I think, there's all kinds of like, you get into a car crash or you're the victim of violent crime or you're in a war zone or something like that. There's nothing that you can do about those things after the whole thing is over, right? And so creating these kind of neural pathways is a really good solution. But this ongoing emergency, something needs to be done. And Frank is uniquely motivated, I think, in a way that, and we're connected to him as readers, so that I think we see the efforts of these professionals, as well-meaning as they are, to be like, hey man, get with the program, right? Like the solution is not for me to stop feeling bad about climate change. The solution is to solve climate change, right? I have this special motivation to do that. Stop discouraging me from doing that. And in a way, this is at a personal level what we've been told for the last, 50, 70 years about escalating climate change, that the professional class is kind of telling everyone else in the society, hey, don't worry about this, get over it, just get back to work, get out there working in the capitalist system, get out there working in the military-industrial complex, go vote, support your local senator, blah, blah, blah. Get with the program, stop worrying about science. But Frank doesn't do that. So he goes back to India, like I said, and he tries to join a group of eco-terrorists, basically, who call themselves the Children of Kali, Kali being the death goddess married to Shiva, who metes out justice to people, based on their karmic disposition. And so this group wants to use violence to cause people to take climate change more seriously and to kind of punish people who are primarily, like, they have a special level of guilt in the eyes of the organization for causing climate change. So executives at oil companies, stuff like that. But they don't allow Frank to join their group. They're like, hey, we feel bad for you, but you could be like, we don't know you from anybody. You're a white guy trying to come and join our group. You're an American. You could be CIA. You could be anybody. Like, you can't be here. We're not for you. Go do your own thing. And Frank is simply not able to do this. His PTSD is too powerful. He's too dysfunctional. He tries to join different organizations, but the panic attacks take him over. He tries to get on a research team in Antarctica. I mean, he successfully does get to Antarctica, with the idea that the climate is so cold that there's no way that he could be triggered. But then there is like a sauna for the scientists there, and he ends up walking past the sauna, and he has a completely, like, total mental physical breakdown when the humidity hits him out in the very, very cold atmosphere. And then he lied on his application about, going through the India event, and because he lied, he's fired and sent away. So all of this kind of failure and rejection and the PTSD, it all piles up on Frank in a way where he goes and kidnaps Mary Murphy, the head of the Ministry for the Future. He kidnaps her back to her apartment, and then he demands that she do more to achieve climate change, like legislation, like to head off the catastrophe that we are barreling towards with the temperature constantly increasing all the time. And she explains to him all the ways in which she is trying to do that, like the legislation, the treaties, the, sanctions that are happening, blah, 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 blah. And Frank's like, hey, that's not enough. You need to have a part of your organization that has like a black ops wing, like a secret part of the organization that goes out there and assassinates people, or like blows up industrial complexes that are contributing to carbon emissions. You need to come up with better policies to persuade the financial institutions of what needs to go on and things like that. And she is appalled by these suggestions because, in a very real way, by being a part of the government system and being a member of the UN and being one of the top leaders, basically in the diplomatic bureaucracy, Mary is very in the tank for the status quo. And as much as like she has good intentions and good meanings for how the future should unfold, like she wants climate change to stop. She wants to reverse carbon emissions. She wants carbon sequestration and, to heal the melting glaciers and on like that. More electric power. But she doesn't have the power to do that. She can't decide these things. She can only advocate for them. And she feels that that's completely appropriate and that violence has no place. And so when I talk about the constellation of factors that exist in the book, this is one of the things about making change through the government, that governments are in the unique position of being able to wield violence. They, kind of claim a monopoly on using violence and call other people using violence illegal. So like when gang members go out and they use violence against people to achieve their goals, the police use violence against them, and the police violence is justified and the gang violence is not, right? Because one is the government and one is not the government. And so by asking this person in the government to use violence when she does not have the authorization to do it, he's asking for her to become kind of something that she's not, and making an appeal to the, I would argue, the kind of true power of government. This is the reason that government can enact changes that the consumers in capitalism simply can't. There's a kind of warped thinking that goes on in the public at large, especially people who are chronically online, that the way to affect change is through buying habits. And it's just like ludicrous. You don't have enough control over the capitalist system to change anything through even mass buying habits. Even if you convinced all of the consumers to not buy this or to buy that, all you're really doing is like subtracting a very small amount of products from the marketplace. You're not actually affecting wider trends of how capitalism operates. The only thing that can do that, the only thing that does do that, the thing that shapes capitalism is governments. We have this notion that it's the other way around, that capitalism shapes the governments, that capitalism has some kind of quote unquote natural shape. But part of the point of the book is that the shape of capitalism, the way that capitalism instrumentalizes both the sellers and the buyers, is shaped by the policies of government. And when capitalism butts up against the boundaries of government policy, what is beyond the boundary of government policy is violence. It's the one thing that capitalism can't do and can't account for. And so like that, it's the thing that they can't fight against, right? And so that is what Frank is asking Mary to do. Leverage the violence that governments have access to against corporations to make them stop. She's horrified by this. She doesn't have permission to do it. It underlines the way in which he is kind of enacting a type of illegal violence on her by kidnapping her. He's not doing anything to hurt her in the scene. It's very much a discussion. And like I said, a way in which Frank kind of becomes her conscience on a certain level, because, as I said before, Mary is very in the tank for the status quo on a certain level. This is not a possibility that even occurred to her. It is so outside the box for her that it never even occurred to her that violence is a tool that was available to her. So some people in security forces noticed on footage that Frank followed Mary up to her room. They don't recognize him. It didn't seem like him taking her up there was something that she was happy about. And so the security forces go up there and kind of kick down the door and arrest Frank. So Mary is saved, but traumatized by the whole thing in a very like smaller way than Frank was traumatized. But I mean, it's a home invasion. It's a kidnapping. It's a traumatizing event. So there's a link between the two characters, I guess, is my claim, that like emotionally they were both traumatized. Frank was traumatized by the event in India. Mary is traumatized by Frank's abduction of her, which was a direct consequence of the event in the first place. And so the trauma changes both of them. It kind of radicalizes both of them because Mary goes back to the Ministry for the Future and talks to her colleagues and says, like, well, what do you think about the idea of a black wing and doing these kind of black ops, industrial sabotage, maybe even assassination? Is that something that we should even be thinking about, or is it just too crazy off the table? And her colleagues are like, well, we don't want to talk about something that may or may not be happening because that way you would be able to not deny it if anybody asked you. And she's like, wait, what? And it turns out there already is a black wing of the Ministry of the Future. They're already carrying out these kind of things in the pursuit of their mandate. And so that's when the story kind of zooms out a little bit and we start to find out that there are like these executives who are flying around the world on private jets. And there is like these drones that go up in the sky and fly in their flight path and get snarled up in the jet engines and lead to catastrophic crashes that kill some of the key executives in the oil industry, in the weapons defense industry, and so on and so forth. Like major players in industries that are contributing to carbon emissions around the globe and who are intractable in their policy views. They're never going to support going against carbon emissions. And then additionally, like even some commercial flights end up going down with these drone strikes. And the overall effect is that people stop trusting the aviation industry. They don't want to fly anymore because it's so unsafe. And the airlines industries are like sending up airplanes that are like mostly or entirely empty and losing lots of money on these flights between places. So there's no point in doing them. And so the entire industry of the airlines kind of shrinks. And this shows like one of the possible solutions to it's like a systemic approach. Once again, like killing certain key executives is not going to solve the problem. The bigger problem is the daily use of jet fuel and the amount of carbon that it's emitting all around the globe. So by scaring people with these kind of terrorist tactics, the effect is that people fly less, which is better for the environment long term. There's an idea that's brought up early in the book called actor network theory. And this is philosophical theory that has to do with climate change, actually put forth by Bruno Latour and other philosophers and scientists. The idea of actor network theory is that it gets rid of the distinction between people and things, or even things and ideas, or kind of like abstractions. When you're talking about the effects, the cause and effects relationship that exists inside of dynamic, complicated situations like climate change. So, for example, in the scenarios that we're talking about, the event that happens in India with high humidity and high temperatures, killing millions of people, could be looked at as an actor in the network of consequences in this story. That event has a direct effect on Frank, who then has a direct effect on Mary, who then has a direct effect on her bureaucracy, who put up the drones that cause the airplane crashes and deaths of executives and the overall diminishment of airplane traffic around the world. And so you can see there the way in which the events are as important as the people that they affect. And it's not necessarily the people who are shaping everything that happens within the network, the consequence of network in this kind of like social reality. The events and the ideas and the people are all kind of on a level playing field, if you will, for having effects on society. So it's a different way of thinking about things that kind of disentangles the relationship that we tend to project onto, like, there's people over here, and then there's nature over there. There's like the natural world, and then there's people, and people mess up nature, they change nature, that like people are special somehow, that they have nothing to do with nature, that they are somehow unnatural, and that everything that they do warps nature and warps reality. And that what we need to do is get people out of nature, and then the world will like return to balance. Instead, this kind of acknowledges the way in which the world has a direct effect on us, and then we respond and have an effect on the world. And there's a back and forth that happens. There's a feedback network going on there. But because there's a feedback network, it gives agency both to the world and like to nature and to humanity. And there's a way in which we are interconnected and a way in which we are the same. And so it's kind of important to think about things in those terms and not to try and come up with solutions that are going to ask society to completely like go into some kind of monastic state where we don't interact with nature. Like, that's not a possibility actually for the future. Instead, we need to find some way that we seek an equality with nature and acknowledge our role in nature and nature's role in us, at least according to, aspects of the actor network theory. So I think that idea informs a lot of the structure of the book, because there are these different like interludes that happen throughout the book where like you'll have the characters talking and events happening, and then you get a chapter break, and then the chapter begins with this kind of first person, very playful kind of like, I am this. It's almost like a riddle, like I am this and I am that and I do this and you do that. And then it asks you like, what am I? And the answer is like some kind of non-human agent. It can be like a photon from the sun, or even like a policy of law, or some other, like the Higgs boson particle or whatever. But they have in the story a point of view. They say, I am, in other words, like they have some kind of agency that is on par with the characters. And so I think Robinson is taking the actor network theory very literally in the book and applying it. Like, the characters are not the only ones who have agency. And there's talk in this early part of the book that has to do with like economy and government are tools that humans have developed, but tools themselves have agency. They have a kind of intention, if you will. And to not use the tool the way that it is intended is going to have very unpredictable effects, because you're just using it in a weird way. But also you have to acknowledge the way in which the tool is designed to do a thing. And so particular outcomes are favored over other outcomes. So you can't use a machine gun to cut up a fresh baked loaf of bread, right? Like, I guess you could, but it's going to be real messy and unpredictable. But you can use a machine gun to murder people. Like, it's really good at that. But it's not good at very much else besides murdering people, right? Like, because that is the disposition of its use. That is kind of its intention, in other words. And so we have to look at things dispositionally. within this actor network. We have to think about things in terms of like, what are they for? What are they good at? And then deploy them in that way and think about our goals in terms of like, okay, we're trying to lower the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Is this the right tool to accomplish that goal? Or should we develop new tools? And some tools we have can be adapted to that purpose, but other ones need to be thrown out. And so, we have motor vehicles, but we don't need the kind of motor vehicles that use fossil fuels. We need to develop new motor vehicles that run on electric power and that source that electric power, from the sun or other renewable sources, for example. So some of our tools, like fossil fuels, are not useful for the goals of lowering carbon emissions, and other tools are useful because they are developed with that intention embedded in them. And they are just better at being used towards that intention than other tools which have the intention built into them already of increasing the carbon in the atmosphere. And so that is an important acknowledgement that needs to be made both like within the book, but I think, the book is kind of giving us a rubric to examine our own world, right? So we should start to think about the real world that we live in the same way, which is what actor network theory does. So that's why Robinson is using it in the book. So some other ideas that come up in the book is this idea of, okay, the glaciers are melting and they're increasing in terms of their melting rate. So every year they're melting faster and faster. How do we stop that? How do we make that slow down? One of the ideas that's pretty radical and would be really expensive is to drill down, just like we would drill for oil, underneath the glacier and pump out the water that the glacier has underneath of it because of the melting process, and have the ice directly touch the bedrock of the earth. And this would cool the glacier down much, much faster than the water, which is going to be constantly transferring more heat to the glacier and kind of speeding up the glacier's melting point. This would actually make it move in the opposite direction and cause the entire glacier system to cool down because the earth is an insulator instead of it being a conductor like water. So this is a science-based approach to the problem that is very impractical because it's very, very expensive. So it's difficult to motivate governments and capital to achieve that thing. But here we are in the emergency state of things happening in the story. And so people start to consider it an option. For one thing, this idea, which exists in the world actually has never been tried. It can't be like experimentally tested because it's just too big of an operation to do. And so in the story, they go to the glaciers, they try it out, they run into all kinds of unexpected problems, which, is something that you would expect to happen. And they do expect to happen, but it makes the process slower. And so they have to keep coming back to it over and over. And it takes a long time for this solution to be perfected. But eventually in the story, it does work. And so we start to do it at the beginning of the book and we come back to it over and over throughout. And near the end of the book, it does end up working. They pump out all of the water from underneath the glacier. It rests on the earth. And after a couple of years, the glacier is starting to grow and its melting has stopped and reversed. So Robinson is kind of making the claim of like, hey, this would work if we would try it. And there's lots of complaining when it first starts of like, it's going to cost so much. It's going to be trillions of dollars. Like, this is crazy. And what's pointed out by the scientists over and over is like, costs are completely made up. Like, if you're going to, like, the only thing that needs to exist is society. Like, costs don't mean anything in the absence of society. And if humans go extinct, it doesn't matter about you lost some profit, right? Because like, we're all dead. So this is a thing that needs to happen on an existential level. In order for us to survive, we need to do this. It doesn't matter how much it costs, in other words. And that's true for a lot of the projects in the story. There's other ideas like deploying satellites into space that will collect solar energy and then beam it down to the Earth in the form of microwave beams that are, tightly focused, to arrays that will use the microwaves to charge batteries. And this is like seen as, well, in theory, you could do it and it's really inefficient. And there's all kinds of you're going to get energy loss in the atmosphere and blah, 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 blah. It's just way more efficient to burn oil or burn coal. And while that's true, those inventions are not, they have the intention of putting carbon into the atmosphere, and this one doesn't. And so we need to move to the technologies that don't put carbon into the atmosphere. And so they start to launch these satellites into the atmosphere to generate electricity directly from the sun. Another thing that happens is because the airline industry, the jet engine industry, is softening due to falling demand on the part of customers because they don't want to die in plane crashes, Zeppelins and other airships become more popular and return to viability. So you can have these kind of reusable structures of airships that don't rely on jet fuel to get people across oceans and other long distances through air travel, but don't rely on carbon jet fuel. And those become more and more popular. And they can simultaneously run on a little bit of solar power. And eventually, the electrical energy gets so efficient in terms of solar power that they end up getting more energy than they need and sending down the energy to these collection centers via microwaves also. And so that not only are they not using carbon, but they are generating electricity so that the whole thing is a net positive in terms of, generating electricity. So it's not using carbon is a plus and making more electricity is a plus. And you get air travel back. So these are all different solutions that are proposed throughout the book. There's a similar thing with sailing ships where the sails have solar arrays built into them and kind of self-power through solar collection. And there's a pivot that happens in terms of the kind of economic dominance of the United States and Russia and Europe to India, because it becomes a leader in this climate change technology since it's highly motivated by the tragedy that happened, and also China because of they just have a lead on the solar technology, but also the structure of their society favors this entire approach where their relationship with capital is that the government directly tells capital, you need to do this, you need to do that, instead of having laws that just coddle the most cynical and quote unquote efficient means of capital realizing profit that happen in Europe and America. And so the entire world starts to more closely emulate China's approach to managing capital than the Euro-American approach to managing capital. Throughout all these things happening, there's a human touch to the novel. So these very big things are happening. We are constantly touching base with different characters here, different characters there, all around the world. And they're telling these little micro stories. And so again, this whole actor network theory, right? And this idea that there's a global movement that needs to happen in order to solve this kind of problem. It can't be the story of one chosen one, or even a small group of people who go on some kind of quest to solve this kind of thing. It's going to take millions and billions of people to solve this problem that millions and billions of people created in the first place. So throughout the entire story, we keep touching base again and again with Frank and Mary. And Mary's relationship to Frank changes throughout the book. Like I said, he becomes more of like a conscience to her. She checks in with him and explains to him, okay, here's what the ministry is doing. What do you think about that? And he's like, well, it's not good enough because of XYZ. And then she kind of takes that and thinks about it and is like, okay. And they also spend time together, out in nature itself and kind of appreciating the world for what it is. There's a whole thing in the book about Switzerland and just the natural beauty of the place, because that's where the UN base is situated. And the restorative effect that nature can have on us as human beings, the way in which we have evolved on this planet to be in, the outdoors and among animals, and the restorative effect that has on us, even though our society has naturally evolved to this point where we have these technological cities and all of these inventions and stuff. We're not more suited to one or the other. We are both at the same time. And so that theme is explored by Frank and Mary spending time together, both in these cityscapes and in these natural landscapes. The other part of the other side of the coin, which might be appropriate, the other part of the story here has to do with the financial sector of both government and capital. And I think people like me tend to think of big finance as the enemy. There's just no redeeming qualities to these financial experts who live in this kind of bizarre philosophical matrix of profits first, people second. The way in which the financial sector vampirically sucks resources from the general public and manipulates governments to work against the interests of the citizens that it is supposed to protect. That's kind of how I personally tend to see finance. That's how I've seen finance interact with history. I think of the financial collapse in the early 2000s that had to do with the over-indexed insurance and mortgage markets, the mismanagement of banks throughout capital's history, like the crash in the 1920s, the several bank runs that happened before that, for the 50, 70 years, 100 years before that. Just the ways in which finance screws over regular people and makes sure that there is always a parachute for the people who are in finance and for the big capitalists. Robinson, I think, correctly acknowledges the way in which if we take that adversarial view of finance, nothing is going to get done. We have to find a way to include all aspects of society in solving this problem, because this problem involves all of us. And the fact is, there's creativity, there are solutions to be had in every aspect of human endeavor. And just like the other aspects of the actor network that we're talking about in this story, finance has certain intentions built into it, and we can build new financial tools that have the intentions of decreasing carbon in the atmosphere and helping the planet to heal so that the mass extinctions slow down, so that the thermometer kind of goes in the other direction and we start to turn this catastrophe around and get back to a more habitable planet for human society. So one of these financial inventions is a cryptocurrency that, like a Bitcoin or that kind of thing, right? Where the coin, quote unquote, is only created when carbon sequestration actually happens, either in the form of carbon capture or in the form of not burning carbon that otherwise would have been burned if this financial instrument did not exist. It goes into this idea in depth in the book several different times so that the reader or somebody like me who really does not understand this stuff, who would generally be opposed to even listening to this kind of idea, it gets you to really understand what's going on here. So I'm not going to try to explain it because I just assume that, like, if you're listening to this, you've read the book. The point being that you can't game the system here, that actual sequestration of some form has to happen in order for the coin to be created, and that the coin is backed by the federal bank of all of the major governments around the world as a type of quantitative easing for long-term investment. So we can invest in the coin for the future and realize a large return for capital that replaces the large profit return that would happen from burning carbon. So this gives the capitalists and the financial sector a way out of the problem of not realizing profits because of not burning carbon, which is kind of ingenious. What it does is leverage the capitalist system to participate in solving the problem instead of contributing to the problem. And so I think my way of thinking before I read the book was that capitalism is never going to be able to contribute to solving the climate change problem in a real way because it would hurt their bottom line too much. By the time the problem got to the point where it would be, quote unquote, worth it to change carbon emissions, it would be too late. Things would be getting warmer and warmer, and the world would be kind of doomed in terms of its ability to sustain human society at the global scale we have with our society right now. This gives us a model of the ways in which capital is not a poison pill necessarily. Again, it just comes down to the structure of the rules that we've put in place for capital. And so the kind of sticks and carrots, if you will, that we have decided as a global society should be available to capital, that's just the path that it's taken. And we can restructure that path. We can create a new path, and we can leverage all of the strengths of capital to reshape the world. We know that it can reshape the world. It's done it. We can use it to reshape the world again and heal it. That's one of the central messages of the book. And every time that I come back to the book, it's something that gives me hope. There's a real, kind of hopefulness to the message of the book, I think. And this is one of the key places for me that it has it, that finance is just a tool, capital is just a tool in the hands of human beings who, if we are creative enough, we can use that to solve the problems that we unintentionally created for ourselves. And we don't have to worry about, systems of justice necessarily and blame and have to use the tools of war. We can use these tools of capital not in the way of driving them according to the dispositions of customers, but in reshaping them through legislation and through the financial incentives that exist in the finance sector and the way that it interacts with government and capital directly. There's a kind of whole separate structure of the world of finance that is disconnected both from government and capital that has a role to play in mediating the direction that capital can go in. And so if you think of a kind of teeter-totter, it is the middle part of the teeter-totter is kind of what I'm saying, the part that creates the balance, but it's also like the fulcrum that we can use to re-leverage capital in the direction of human flourishing. Because there's a real argument to be had for capitalism has fundamentally changed human society for the better. And like, I would listen to that argument. There's all kinds of things that about capitalism that have made my life and the life of my family better, society at large better. And there's all kinds of ways that it's made it worse too, right? But that means that it has the power to do that again. We just have to figure out how to make that happen. And so this kind of cryptocurrency suggestion in the book, this quantitative easing of the future profits being located in sequestering carbon, not adding carbon to the chemistry system of the earth, and so on and so forth, being part of the solution. Eventually, Frank goes to prison for a completely unrelated event. Like, he has a warrant out for his arrest because of the whole thing with Mary and him running away, and he gets involved in helping out some people who have become climate refugees, and they're being held, I guess, quote unquote, in Europe. They're definitely put in camps, which is terrible. They're kind of segregated from the rest of society. They're not allowed to assimilate. And there's ways in which the climate refugees are treated as second-class citizens. They're not allowed to go back to their original countries of origin because of the effects of climate change in those areas and how there are no jobs. There's like social instability, but they're not allowed to assimilate into places, like Switzerland and Norway and Germany and stuff, because they don't want to absorb the cost economically of retraining all these people, like, different languages, different culture, blah, 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 blah. And so Frank tries to help these people and ends up running across the police while he's involved in altruistically helping someone with a medical emergency. He's arrested. Mary kind of advocates for him. They spend time together. They get to know each other. I think they really care about each other. And then Frank ends up passing away. On the one hand, this just has to do with simple human mortality. Frank, is not going to live forever. The book takes place over decades. There's a long period of time that happens here because we need enough time to pass for us to actually see change, and kind of like geologic time takes a lot of time, obviously, right? And so Frank's death, I think, reminds us of the ways in which, humans are finite. We only have so much time on this earth. How we're spending that time really matters. I think as a reader, I feel that Frank is a good person who was unjustly managed by society. I can understand why he was locked up. I can understand everything that every institution did with Frank, but I always feel like he was treated unfairly and that the things that he cared about should have been more important to everyone around him. That basically that Frank was right and that society is wrong. I think that's how we're supposed to feel. I think that's what Robinson wants us to feel about Frank. And ultimately, it's kind of how Mary feels about Frank. She's of two minds. She doesn't like what Frank did to her. She has a certain satisfaction, a kind of human animal feeling of revenge at watching him die. But there's a real, that's a very low down feeling for her, and is kind of the smallest part of it, I think. And the much bigger part is a grief, a feeling of loss, and a way in which his priorities become synthesized into her. And so you can see the way in which people affect each other, that Mary is a different person, and that the difference in her changes the organization that she is the leader of, which in turn helps to change the world. And so everything that Frank did actually have an effect on the world and help to heal it. And so I think Robinson is kind of positing a way in which the reader might feel like, well, I'm not in government. I'm not a leader of capital. I'm not a leader of finance. What is it that I'm supposed to do? And I think the answer that's given to us, via the internet and social media and workplaces so often is just you should be a good citizen. You should leverage your place in the capitalist system to buy things that are quote unquote ethical, and that will help to, like buy green, and that will change the world to be greener. And that's the answer. And this answer is inadequate, I think, is part of the point of the book. And Robinson is showing that, like, actually, we have us, the regular people, the people who are not the leaders of the world, have a direct effect on the leaders of the world via human relationship, and not this kind of institutional relationship necessarily. That there is an intellectual, emotional connection that exists that is more primary and does more to move things than this economic relationship that is so often overemphasized. So Frank changes Mary. Mary helps to change her institution, which helps to change the world. That's the kind of chain of consequence I think that the book shows us. Mary ends up also retiring from the Ministry of the Future because she is getting older. She helps the organization to continue. It comes under new management, which she feels is good and is managing to build on the work that she did. But then she kind of reinvests her time into, what would make her happy in her retirement. How does she want to live her life? Where does she want to live it? What are her, personal priorities? And all of that is kind of informed by watching Frank die in hospice and seeing the kind of shape of his life and the things that were important to him and how she felt about that. The ways in which Frank was kind of ruled by his trauma and defined by this catastrophe that happened to him in the past that really limited the relationships that he was able to have with different people. Like Frank got married at one point, he had kids, but he lost that family, he lost those kids, he lost all of those relationships because he couldn't cope with the trauma of the disaster in India. Mary doesn't want that to be her ending. And so there's a kind of balance, I think, that Robinson is pointing towards, that as important as climate change is and as radicalized as maybe we should all become in tackling that problem, we should not forego the things that as human beings give meaning to life and make the world worth being a part of. That just like, being radicalized is another human tool that has intentions that can reshape the way that we experience life. Just like the tools of, an automobile that burns gasoline will contribute carbon to the atmosphere versus a vehicle that runs on electricity and doesn't contribute carbon. We can prioritize saving the world from climate change without foregoing going on hikes in nature, having our hobbies, falling in love, creating families, participating in institutions that are meaningful to us, and on and on and on. We don't have to give that stuff up. In other words, it goes back to what I talked about with the actor network theory and the way that actor network theory is a response to the kind of totalizing logic that claims you have humans over here on one side and you have nature on this other side, and the two are not possible to mix. That humanity will always warp nature, that nature is perfect and pristine, and that humans should be removed from it. And that is the only solution to this kind of problem. In that kind of totalizing logic, humanity would turn on itself and become utterly violent to all of the people who would try to build anything worth living in for human beings going forward. In other words, the book makes the optimistic claim that humans, an advanced human society with electronic technology and the internet and, mass transit and personal transit, all of that stuff, human flight, space exploration, it all has a place in the future that is in balance with the world and doesn't leave this dangerous mark on geologic time that will wipe out all life on the planet as we know it right now. We can continue to exist. We just can't continue to exist as we are. And that's a hopeful message in the book. In terms of like the kind of climate fiction that's out there tends to be post-apocalyptic. It tends to be kind of end of the world. It's awfully pessimistic a lot of times. And while there's drama and there's pessimism and there's darkness in the book, overall, I think that the book has a lot of hope and that it's very clear-eyed and level-headed about the approaches that we can take and the way that we need to think about the tools at hand for the problem we face. So every time that I read the book, it makes me feel better about the possible future. It gives me hope about what we as humans can accomplish. I would just love to see more of it in actual real life, I guess. But all I can do, I guess, is vote for the people who I feel would bring about that change and support the institutions and organizations that would push it forward and continue to think about and talk about these things. But yeah, it's a great book. It's a way of not being pessimistic about this extremely huge existential crisis that faces all of the global society.